our moment of silence to pay our respects to John Lennon.
The death of John Lennon took the whole world by surprise. It was a moment that sent shockwaves around the globe, leaving fans in disbelief and the music community in mourning. But what happened behind the scenes? How did the surviving members of the Beatles react to the loss of their creative force, John Lennon? Grab your seats and let's journey together through the untold story of the Beatles' controversial reaction to John Lennon's death. John Lennon's death. Although John Lennon doesn't really need an introduction, it's difficult to discuss the singer without bringing up his enormous influence on music. In addition to having one of the most successful songwriting collaborations in music history with fellow Beatle Paul McCartney, John Lennon himself became a symbol of movements and a genre-bending force. The immense amount of attention that John Lennon received after his death was the only thing that could compare to his fame during his lifetime. The Beatle was brutally killed. A crazy fan shot him. For what reason? If you were his fan, wouldn't you respect him? Let's rewind a bit and remember what happened. Of all the shocking events in popular culture, John Lennon's death stood out. The legendary Beatles' life was sadly cut short in 1980, just after he recorded and released Double Fantasy, his first album in 5 years. The other three Beatles were asked to speak almost immediately after the renowned singer passed away, as the world struggled to come to terms with his passing. The world was shocked to learn that Beatles icon John Lennon had been assassinated on December 8, 1980. The assailant was a man by the name of Mark Chapman, who shot Lennon dead just outside his home. 1 month earlier, on November 8, Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono had just released their collaboration album, Double Fantasy. Apart from doing a Rolling Stone photo shoot that day, Lennon and Ono were in New York to promote the album. Early in the day, the pair posed for Annie Leibovitz, the photographer. One of the most famous pictures of the two came from that photo shoot. On the day of his murder, Lennon also gave his last interview to the media, this time with RKO Radio. Then, something unsettling happened on the way to the record plant studio. Chapman approached the Beatle outside the Dakota to request an autograph. A few hours later, Chapman would kill Lennon. Lennon was asked to sign his copy of Double Fantasy by the soon-to-be murderer, and he did so. Before shooting Lennon, he was employed as a security guard in Hawaii and had no past offenses. He was 25 years old. The fact that Chapman had been a long-standing follower of the Beatles was even more unsettling. However, Chapman turned against Lennon following his controversial 1966 claim that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. The lines of Lennon's later songs, God and Imagine, which contained passages that might be interpreted as disparaging Christianity, started to anger him. Around the time of the shooting, Lennon's killer apparently developed an obsession with Holden Caulfield, the fictitious protagonist of the book The Catcher in the Rye. It is said that Chapman aspired to be like the rebellious Caulfield, and at the time of Lennon's murder, he was carrying a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. Chapman was charged with second-degree murder shortly after being taken into custody at the site. He has been turned down from parole 11 times now while he is still a prisoner at Greenhaven Correctional Facility in New York. He was very kind to me, Chapman said about the interaction in a later parole hearing. Ironically, very kind, and he was patient with me. The limousine was waiting. His wife was waiting in the limousine, and he took his time with me, and he got the pen going, and he signed my album. He asked me if I needed anything else. I said no, sir, and he walked away. Very cordial and a very decent man. Chapman was asked during the parole hearing if his initial interaction with the victim made him reconsider his plans to commit murder. Yes, he said. There was an inner struggle for a while there, you know. What am I doing here? Leave now. It wasn't all totally cold-blooded, but most of it was. I did try to tell myself to leave. I've got the album. Take it home. Show my wife. Everything will be fine. But I was so compelled to commit that murder that nothing would have dragged me away from that building. Chapman remained outside, waiting for Lennon and Ono to return to the Dakota later that evening. Lennon was struck by 4 of Chapman's 5 shots as he was entering their house. The other 2 struck him in the shoulder and back. After being taken to the hospital, Lennon was declared dead. In addition to its senselessness, Lennon's murder was shocking since he avoided many of the other traps associated with being a rock star. Steve Van Zandt is quoted in Times Memorial as saying the day after John Lennon passed away, he beat the rock and roll life. Beat the fame, beat the drugs, and beat the harm. The only person to beat it all was him. This was totally out of the blue, so it makes sense that the aftershock was only getting started, as the article stated, with flowers and placards. Each of them, in spite of their differences, was shocked to hear the news and lamented the passing of their friend and former bandmate. Ringo Starr. Ringo Starr was on vacation in the Bahamas when he learned of the news. Starr promptly took a plane to New York after learning of the news in order to comfort Yoko Ono, John Lennon's then wife. In the end, Starr mentioned the news to Lennon's ex-wife Cynthia and played with his son Sean, who was just 4 years old at the time. He disclosed in the 1988 interview with Michael Aspel, "I was close to the man. I loved the man. And I still miss the man. He went out in such a stupid way, and the guy is famous now, for God's sake." We were in the Bahamas at the time, and my stepdaughter Francesca, Barbara's daughter, called and she said there is some kind of news about John, a shooting and things like that. Then they called back and they said he had actually died. So we sat around and were just devastated. I was just down, he admitted. At 5 a.m, he placed his plane order and took off for New York. He wanted to see if there was anything he could do. When you find yourself in that circumstance, you just have to act. And that's what Barbara and he did. Ringo told Barbara Walters in 1981, barely a year after John's murder, that he was the last member of the Beatles to see John alive. He remembered that they had met while he was staying at the Plaza. They spent some time in New York, and he spent an hour visiting with Yoko. They stayed for 5 hours since they were having so much fun. The fact that a year had passed since their last encounter didn't matter. When they did, everything was always okay. George Harrison. Early in the morning, George Harrison received the call with the news. He had been notified by his sister, who lives in the United States. He hung up, thinking it was only a nightmare or terrible dream, and went back to sleep. He knew it was real, and that this had been his coping mechanism for the pain when he woke up hours later, but he didn't want to accept it. I was in bed at the time, in England. The call came through sometime in the morning, 4 or 5 in the morning. I didn't take the call. Olivia took the call and she said, "John's been shot." And I thought, "Oh, how bad is it?" I just thought maybe a flesh wound or something like that. But she said, "No, that's it. He's dead." He continued, "I just went back to sleep, actually. Maybe it was just a way of getting away from it. I just went to sleep and waited to see what it said the next morning. And he was still dead the next morning, unfortunately. After everything we've been through together, I had and still have great love and respect for John. I'm shocked," Harrison would later express. George continued, explaining that he wasn't being distant or impolite in any way because of his ideas about life and death. There has never been a moment in the Bhagavad Gita when you didn't exist, and there will never be a moment when you stop existing. The only thing that shifts is our physical state. From the moment of our birth till our death, the soul enters the body. We had a lot of experiences. I know John. He knew who he was, that he was a soul that happened to be in this body for this period of time," Harrison added. "I think it's unfortunate the way he went out, but it really doesn't matter. He's okay, and life flows on within you and without you." He had his own views, but it was still devastating to lose a close friend. Before he passed away in 2001, George had these feelings regarding his own life. Since all those years ago was the song he was working on in the studio when he was killed, he rewrote the lyrics as an homage to John. A statement he made the day after John passed away read, "After all we went through together, I had and still have great love and respect for him. I'm shocked and stunned. To rob a life is the ultimate robbery in life," Harrison wrote. "The perpetual encroachment on other people's space is taken to the limit with the use of a gun. It is an outrage that people can take other people's lives when they obviously haven't got their own lives in order." Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney seemed like the closest person to John, but his reaction felt otherwise. People were anticipating a less casual response considering the duo's joint musicianship altered popular culture. In fact, as soon as the Beatles fans learned that McCartney's former partner had been killed, they attacked him for being relatively cruel. But Paul was obviously distraught and at the point was unable to make sense of what had transpired. When Paul and Linda McCartney were questioned by Playboy magazine in 1984, Paul talked candidly about his immediate response to the startling event. With John's thing, what could you say? The pain is beyond words. You can never describe it. I don't care how articulate you are. We just went home. We just looked at all the news on the telly, and we sat there with all the kids just crying all evening. When asked about his drag reply, Paul replied, "I had just finished a whole day in shock, and I said, it's a drag. I meant drag in the heaviest sense of the word, you know. It's a drag. But, you know, when you look at that in print, it says, yes, it's a drag. Matter of fact." Paul McCartney was informed by his manager. While neither he nor his spouse Linda can recall the specifics of the conversation or his response, Linda does recall the expression on McCartney's face. Later, Linda would say that she had never seen him look like that. It was excruciating torture. On the same day, McCartney met George Martin, his producer. Martin claims that after holding each other tight for several minutes while crying, they spoke for hours. Sir Paul McCartney is now talking candidly about that difficult period in his friendship and musical soulmate relationship with John Lennon in his new book, Lyrics, 1956 to the Present. "John turned nasty when we broke up, and everyone was now flailing around," says McCartney. Fortunately, he was able to patch things up with Lennon before his untimely death on December 8, 1980. I don't really understand why. Maybe because we grew up in Liverpool, where it was always good to get in the first punch of a fight. Almost precisely 10 years previously, on December 31, 1970, legal actions had been launched to end the Beatles' collaboration. In the same month, a resentful and unprocessed Lennon released John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, his first comprehensive solo album. The record exposed the psychological scars that had been allowed to fester during the last days of the Beatles, following months of psychologically torturous primal scream therapy. The album's standout track, God, concludes with the dramatic declaration, "I don't believe in Beatles, I just believe in myself," which in the beginning of the 1970s verged on heresy. Lennon met with chief editor of Rolling Stone, Jan Wenner, shortly after the album's release to offer fans a first-hand peek at the band's most scandalous records. He continued to throw shots at McCartney for his perceived bossiness in the studio, his seeming disdain for his new wife, Yoko Ono, and his allegedly timid solo debut, McCartney, 1970. For the following 5 years, Lennon essentially gave up on music and gave his entire life to Sean's care. It seemed only fitting that his former partner encouraged him to take up the guitar again. Lennon heard McCartney's electro-tinged 1980 single, Coming Up, a unique song that seemed to foreshadow the new wave movement that was about to take off. Somewhere, Lennon said of his comeback album, Double Fantasy, John described Coming Up as a good piece of work. He'd been lying around not doing much, so it sort of shocked him out of inertia. So it was nice to hear that it had struck a chord with him. The timing was especially harsh for McCartney, as he and Lennon had just begun to restore the warmth that had been missing for a long time. However, this also made saying goodbye simpler at the same time. "I was very glad of how we got along in those last few years, that I had some really good times with him before he was murdered," he states. "If he had died when our relationship was still toxic, it would have been the worst thing in the world for me. I would have felt like I should have done everything right. It would have been a huge guilt trip. Fortunately, their most recent meeting was cordial, and they discussed a variety of topics. It was also a turning point in his notoriously troubled relationship with Ono, who was suddenly put into the coveted position of being the most well-known widow in rock and roll. Of course, from then on, really, I was very sympathetic to Yoko. I'd lost my friend, but she'd lost her husband and the father of her child. The greatest way McCartney knew to honor his friend was with a song. Composed during tug-of-war recording sessions in 1982, Here Today is a somber acoustic ballad in which McCartney pays tribute to his departed buddy by revisiting moments they had in common. Knowing that the Beatles reacted this way to John's death, are you wondering how the whole world reacted after that? How the world reacted. The majority of British people didn't learn about the tragedy until they watched the morning or even midday news programs on TV because it happened at around 4 a.m. UK time, and there were no rolling news networks at the time. Alan J. Weiss, a news producer for network WABC-TV in the United States, was hurt in a motorcycle accident earlier that evening and was being treated at Roosevelt Hospital. In 2013, he claimed to have witnessed Lennon being led into a room full of police officers. When he realized what had happened, he dialed the station. After a while, the information reached ABC News president Roone Arledge, who was in charge of ABC's Monday Night Football coverage at the time. With less than a minute remaining in a game between the Miami Dolphins and the New England Patriots, Arledge learned that Lennon had passed away. Arledge informed Howard Cosell and Frank Gifford, two commentators, about the incident and suggested that they cover it live. Cosell wasn't sure since he thought it wasn't their place to break such a significant event. He had interviewed Lennon back in 1974. Gifford convinced Cosell to do so, saying that he should not hang on to the news. There is no funeral for John. John loved and prayed for the human race. Please do the same for him, Yoko Ono said in a statement the day after Lennon passed away. In Hartsdale, Westchester County, New York, in Ferncliff Cemetery, his remains were cremated. She requested that they meet again the following Sunday in the Central Park bandshell for 10 minutes of silent prayer, telling the chanting audience outside the Dakota that their singing had kept her awake. Millions of people worldwide did just that on December 14. They observed a 10-minute silent period in honor of Lennon. 30,000 mourners gathered in Liverpool, the hometown of John Lennon. Over 2,000 people congregated at Central Park. All radio stations in New York City went off the air for those 10 minutes. Fans at the moment expressed their grief in great numbers. Lennon's new single, Just Like Starting Over, soared to the top of the UK singles chart the week following his passing. His well-known holiday single, Happy Christmas, War Is Over, was revived and peaked at number 4 the following week. A reissued version of Imagine spent 5 weeks at number 1 in the first week of January 1981. The new single, Woman, then took his spot at the top. Celebrities also had a hard time processing the grief. When Stevie Wonder learned of John Lennon's passing while backstage at one of his own performances, he broke the devastating news to an appalled audience. The night following Lennon's passing, Queen gave a performance of Imagine at London's Wembley Arena. On December 8, 1983, the third anniversary of John Lennon's passing, David Bowie, who had been close friends with Lennon since the mid-1970s, paid a heartfelt homage to the late singer by singing Imagine at the Hong Kong Coliseum during the last performance of his Serious Moonlight tour. Empty Garden, Hey Hey Johnny is a memorial to John Lennon that Elton John and Bernie Taupin recorded. Ono and Sean joined him on stage as he performed the song at Madison Square Garden in August 1982. The Lasts. When Lennon and Elton John recorded Whatever Gets You Through the Night in 1974, they bet that the song would become the #1 hit in the United States. If Lennon lost, he would perform with John at Madison Square Garden. The song reached the top of the Hot 100 chart on November 16, 1974, which paved the way for Lennon to accompany John on stage for performances of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and I Saw Her Standing There just 12 days later. This was Lennon's final live performance. Lennon was pictured with his killer in one of the final images ever captured of him alive. It's possible that the final image of John Lennon was captured when he autographed a double fantasy book for a fan on December 8, 1980, because that fan turned out to be Mark David Chapman, who would return 5 hours later to kill Lennon outside his Upper West Side apartment in New York. When Ono asked Lennon if he wanted to go out to supper, he said, "No, let's go home because I want to see Sean, their son, before he goes to sleep," which were his last words before Chapman shot 4 bullets into his back. As soon as word spread of the public assassination, people flocked to Lennon's house to pay their respects, and the media portrayed him as a family guy who loved peace and had an immense effect on the world through music. In the 1980s, Paul McCartney said, "Since his death, he's become Martin Luther Lennon." Truth be told, John Lennon was a dynamic personality with a caustic sense of humor, an abundance of talent, and a distinct self-awareness that made him a critic of idolization as well as one of the most revered musicians in the world. Everyone always talks about a good thing coming to an end as if life was over, but I'll be 40 when this interview comes out. We're all relatively young people. The game isn't over yet. John Lennon to Playboy, December 7, 1980. The Beatles' relationship. George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon founded the Beatles in 1960. By 1962, Ringo Starr had become a permanent fixture on the drum kit. The quartet of youthful men from Liverpool proceeded to ignite a global frenzy known as Beatlemania and produce what are largely regarded as some of the greatest records and tracks in history. But the Beatles broke up in 1970 as a result of growing tensions that eventually became intolerable after longtime manager Brian Epstein passed away. Unfortunately, none of the members were ever able to get back together in full. Instead, they all went their separate ways. The Beatles are almost guaranteed to appear on any list of bands that managed to succeed in spite of interpersonal problems. The ex-bandmates were open about their lack of affections for one another after the band broke up. They created scathing songs against one another, handled a highly public litigation, and spoke poorly of one another in the press. It's simple to presume that the Beatles did not get along with one another outside of their formative years as a band. But that's not even close to the whole truth. Contrary to popular belief, the Beatles had closer friendships. A meeting between 2 young artists in Liverpool, England, decades ago would forever alter the direction of popular music. The date was July 6, 1957. In the middle of a stifling heat wave, 16-year-old John Lennon was performing with his skiffle group, the Quarrymen, at a church garden party. In the crowd was 15-year-old Paul McCartney, donning a white sports jacket adorned with a pink carnation. The Dell Vikings' "Come Go With Me" was covered by the Quarrymen. Although Lennon obviously didn't understand the lyrics, he substituted blues song lyrics. McCartney was intrigued by Lennon's inventiveness and met him after the set. Lennon was impressed when McCartney performed Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock backstage, maybe because McCartney truly knew every word. Afterwards, Lennon recalled his initial anxiety about collaborating with a formidable musician who could potentially undermine his authority within the ensemble. But as you know, that hesitancy did not last long. I turned around right then on the first meeting and said, "Do you want to join the group?" And I think he said yes the next day, said Lennon. Even though they wouldn't adopt the name The Beatles for another 3 years, the hot summer day encounter between both young artists marked the beginning of a creative collaboration that produced nearly 200 songs with a combined value of about $1 billion. It seems amazing to consider that this remarkable career is all owed to a single event, that afternoon's coincidental meeting in a Liverpool church hall. Mike Lindsay Hogg's documentary, Let It Be, was released not long after the Beatles split up. Many viewers felt that the band was on the verge of breaking up after watching the documentary. They quarreled, were patronizing, and didn't seem to enjoy each other's company. The common perception of the Beatles has been that, although producing some of the most important music of the 20th century, they were not friends. But in reality, this wasn't the case. Who doesn't fight with their closest friends? While they were together, they argued. George Harrison got fed up with Paul McCartney and John Lennon's condescension, and once they announced their breakup, they engaged in media warfare. Even at their darkest moments, the band found it difficult to let go of their affection for one another. This sums up their connection well. Together, they weathered a very turbulent 10 years, worn down by the demands of success and celebrity. Even though they had arguments, their affection for one another as a family remained. Harrison gave in. Even though he was so irritated that he declared he would never collaborate with McCartney again, McCartney made an appearance on his album Somewhere in England in 1980. Even though they had arguments, the Beatles' ex-members still had affection for one another. Long after the band disbanded, they continued to be connected. Why did the Beatles fall out? There had been tension among the band members for a while when the Beatles broke up. They were all, in different ways, ready to move on. Harrison had had enough of Lennon and McCartney undervaluing him, and they were all perplexed by Ono's odd presence at the studio. Nonetheless, their management was a major factor in their breakup. The band hired Alan Klein following the passing of longtime manager Brian Epstein. McCartney, who would have chosen his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, was the only one who did not oppose his appointment. When the Beatles broke up, McCartney sued them because they had started fighting over business matters. After a public outcry over the lawsuit, Ringo Starr, Lennon, and Harrison came to the conclusion that McCartney had been correct to have mistrusted Klein. In 1973, they let him go. Lennon stated, "I don't want to go into the details of why we finally gave him the push, although there are many reasons why we did," according to the Beatles' Diaries Volume 2 after the breakup. Perhaps Paul was right to suspect this, and the timing was perfect. The Beatles after John. A song named All Those Years Ago, a remembrance of their friend, was written by the trio months later. The session musicians on Harrison's album Somewhere in England, which was still in development, anticipated that their plans for the day would be postponed. Drummer Dave Maddox told Uncut Magazine that Ray Cooper called the morning before the recordings and stated, "I'm not sure whether it's going to happen. I inquired as to why. Are you unaware of this?" After saying John Lennon has been shot, Ray hung up the phone for 2 or 3 hours. When he did, he said something like, "I spoke with George and he thinks that trying to make music would be more therapeutic than him sitting around and being besieged by the press and God knows what else." With that, the session proceeded. Cooper claims that Harrison learned of Lennon's assassination when he was working on All Those Years Ago. In the wee hours of the morning, George was returning home to London, having just completed the vocals for the song All Those Years Ago, of all things. The news of John's murder broke over the radio. He reversed the vehicle on the M4 and returned immediately. George was inconsolable. There was something very unique between him and John. He had composed a song about him and loved him. Harrison would later pay homage to Lennon by changing the words of All Those Years Ago. Harrison invited Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, who was initially scheduled to perform All Those Years Ago, to contribute to the song in order to complete the circle. It would be the group's only song together until they got back together for the anthology project over 10 years later, and it would be their first collaboration since the Beatles dissolved more than 10 years earlier. Paul described how he found a makeshift studio and just sat on the wooden floor in a corner with my guitar and just started to play the opening chords after the emotions had sort of settled a little bit when writing the 1982 hit song Here Today, which was a tribute to his relationship with John Lennon. He then discussed the references in the song, saying, "The night we cried, that was to do with the time when we were in Key West down in Florida, and for some reason, I think it was like a hurricane. Something had been delayed and we couldn't play for a couple of days, so we holed up in a little motel. So what would we do? Well, we'd have a drink and we would get drunk. We got drunk and started to get kind of emotional," he continued. "On the way to that, there was a lot of soul searching. We told each other a few truths, you know? Well, I love you. I love you, man. I love that you said that." And we opened up. And there you have it. The controversial reactions from the Beatles following the tragic and untimely death of their bandmate, John Lennon. The impact of such a loss on the music world and beyond is immeasurable, leaving fans and fellow musicians grappling with a profound sense of grief. If you enjoyed this video and want to stay tuned for more intriguing insights into the world of music and its legends, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. That's all for now. Thank you so much for watching.